Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. This is Barb Chamberlain. I'll be your moderator for this session. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes to settle into the space and transition from whatever you were doing before. One or 2 minutes here. Good afternoon and welcome to another session of the Washington Bike, Walk, and Roll Summit presented by Amazon. My name is Barb Chamberlain. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the director of the Active Transportation Division at the Washington State Department of Transportation. We're really excited that we have over 500 people registered for this virtual event over the course of 5 days. We want to start with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual, and we are on many lands among all of these participants. Cascade Bicycle Club's location is rooted on the lands of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish. We acknowledge the land that Cascade sits on and is resident on today as the traditional home of those tribal nations. If you don't know whose lands you're on, wherever you're participating from, in a couple of minutes in the chat, I will drop in a link to a map that you can use to look up your place on the land so you can honor your people as well. Without these people, we would not have access to this environment. We want to take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. We also want to note that we're recording this session and it will be available following the summit. The summit's hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington State, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclists' rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels with expert speakers and make registration free for all attendees. Thank you so much to Amazon, our presenting sponsor. And then we also thank our supporting sponsors, the Washington State Department of Transportation, the Active Transportation Division, and Eastern Washington Region. And thanks also to our general sponsors, the U.S. Department of Transportation Federal Highways Administration, and Stacey Bain Bike Lawyers. With that, and before we transition to introducing this summit session, we'd like to take a moment to articulate the community expectations we have for all of our sessions. We'll maintain a standard of conduct to ensure that everyone feels safe and respected. We believe every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and to be free from all forms of harassment. So we ask you to be fully present in this session. Be self-responsible and self-challenging. Listen, 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 and process. Suspend judgment of yourself and others and use respectful language towards each other and the panel. If you have any questions or concerns during the session, feel free to reach out to the chat monitors through the personal message feature on the chat bar. And with that, I want to quickly introduce our session, our wonderful lineup of panelists on this important topic today. This is our post-keynote discussion about mobility justice in active transportation. Our panelists are Dr. Charles Brown with Equitable Cities, Dr. Destiny Thomas with the Thrivance Group, Segura, and Edwin Lindo. These Black and Brown community leaders are going to be talking with us for a deeper conversation and a dialogue around race, racism, and active transportation. We can follow up on the issues that Dr. Brown discussed in the keynote earlier today, including how we bring anti-racism and mobility justice to transportation planning, advocacy, and infrastructure. And with that, we will ask our panelists to get rolling, if you will, walking or rolling, whichever way you want to do it, and talk about what our terms mean here. What's mobility justice? What does it look like in the communities we work in? And when people talk about anti-racism and mobility justice, what does that mean to you? How do you discuss this work and how do you define it? Lots of questions there, and I'll let you take it away.
Go ahead, Charles, define it.
I was going to let you, I'm still a Southern gentleman, so I'm going to punt the ball to you to allow you to define that, if you don't mind, Doc.
Sure. Well, to me, mobility justice is less about mode choice, although that's important, and more about freedom of movement, freedom to navigate space and place in the absence of racism, right? And so I'm very aware of, through my own racialized experience, I'm very aware of what it means to be hyper visible no matter what mode I choose, and what risks come with that. And so I think in this day and age, I've kind of moved into a place where, I let other folks worry about which mode we're going to choose this year. And I'm just focused on making sure that when people who are out there looking like me, they make it home.
I have a very brief definition for mobility justice. For me, echoing Dr. Thomas, it's really about freedom. There's an absence of freedom which demands mobility justice be a thing that we discuss and we consider, regardless of the modality in which is being discussed. But in the context of bicycling, we're calling for and advocating for mobility justice because there's a recognition and an acknowledgement that not all people have been free to be mobile, physically as well as socially. And so mobility justice is demanding that freedom be restored. One can argue that freedom never existed for certain populations, particularly Black and Brown, but at a minimum, we are demanding that freedom be restored. And the restoration of freedom is what justice would really look like. And so that's, to me, in a broad sense, what mobility justice is all about.
Yes, do you want to take that question up then next, and then Dr. Lindo?
Yeah, so mobility justice for me as a new mobility transportation planner, we use the word equity a lot. And for me, I would consider using race, ethnicity, ages, all abilities, sexualities, gender identities, and including that if you are doing some type of analysis. So I know there's people that have more formal or like Charles has that definition, but for me, I look at it more analytical and would use those terms in order to help define mobility justice.
Do y'all feel like the term justice is being co-opted a little bit though by our field?
In the context of mobility?
Yeah, like I think that the use of the term, I grew up in a social justice household and was raised to have like a really deep understanding about the struggles that came before us and what our individual and collective roles are in that work. And I think that justice work, social justice work, requires a degree of mutual accountability amongst people within the community for progress. And I think we talk about mobility justice a lot, and we come up with 10-step plans and frameworks and catchphrases to inspire people toward mobility justice. But I'm not sure that many of us have ever attempted to actually redistribute power or access power in a way that would substantially move the needle. I don't know if what we're getting at is justice, social justice work. I just feel like that's a strong term, and I'm not sure my ancestors would have referred to the work we're doing as mobility justice work.
I appreciate that, Dr. Thomas. I mean, I think I feel similarly in that when folks say, well, what type of work do you do? It fits into a framework of liberation, because when we talk about movement, we're talking about space. We're talking about what has historically been the confines of ownership of property of human beings, of where you get to work, of your labor. You only get to move because your boss or your owner told you you could. And how do we recalibrate that to say we need to abolish that mentality that somehow we're gifting people the ability to move, when the truth is that we've always, at least society, white supremacy, and I say supremacy not because we believe that there's supremacy there, but there's a misconception that there is white supremacy. But that notion still likes to colonize things as though somehow it is, we're offering this. I mean, let's think about in Seattle, we have the trains that run, and we have teenagers that go to high school that take the train who can't afford to pay for the $1.50, but then we pay $80,000 to law enforcement to ticket these kids for $150 when they couldn't even afford the $1.25, right? And if we actually, and we did the math, if you took the salary of a fare enforcement, we could actually give all these children free fare to take the bus. But we don't want to do that because the belief of we're giving it away. Well, let's be very clear. The folks that we're so-called giving it away to, they paid the price a long time ago. And it's actually bringing justice. But we have to really catapult our minds in a different way, because colonization is a deep thing that it's hard for us to step away from.
Right, because what is mobility, right? Where are we moving to? Where are we moving from? And I think that even when we talk about things like key destinations, first and last mile solutions, I think what we denote when we use those terms and mark those places on maps, I think we still do the work of denoting that we want equitable access to move around and over and across our communities without placing a demand on those same institutions and agencies to do intra-community network planning, or to even like you said, reimagine, redefine what it is to move, what it is to be connected. And there are very few opportunities for sort of like a self-determined notion of travel and destination. Everything about mobility planning and mobility justice work seems like this constant struggle for free access to, equitable access to an opportunity to get to some job that's probably exploiting you, right, on a substandard transit network. And so it's just interesting to me. Yeah.
And we get used as pawns for our own gentrification to say this is such a rich, culturally amazing environment. You want to move here, we're going to put a brilliantly beautiful bus stop. And in California, for example, every bus stop, the rent is 20% more than outside of the bus stop. And so it's not an accident. We can't afford to live where the transportation is.
One of the critiques I have with the way we talk about mobility justice is that it feels almost as if we're asking for permission. I want to be clear. When I talk about the fight for mobility justice, it's an acknowledgement that an injustice exists, but I'm not sort of requesting that in my pursuit of freedom, that one grants me the right to be free. the right to be free is an individual and a collective movement towards demanding something, not asking for permission. And so a lot of these discussions that we have around mobility justice to the audience feels a lot like victims, like we're victims of something. Because a trauma was placed upon us doesn't mean that we're still victims. It could simply mean that we have acknowledged that in the past something has happened and is currently happening. But I want to be clear that when I talk about mobility justice and my demand for it, in no way am I a victim. Because my very existence here today to talk about the injustices is sort of symbolic of the fact that I've overcome a lot of trauma, a lot of injustices, and am continuing my fight towards the freedom that I think I need individually as well as my community holistically. So we're not victims in the modern sense.
I'm trying to think about what my definition of victimhood is, but I think that's a tangent, so I'm gonna leave that where it is. But I do think that there is still, I know you're not saying that there's not still harm happening.
There's still harm.
Okay.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. What I'm saying is we're not just gonna sit down and allow the harm to.
I got you.
Right.
We're not gonna take it. Yeah.
I want to make sure I don't step on any panelists anytime you're pausing for thought. It's fine for us to pause for thought. I'm going to ask you to sort of run with this idea a little farther about what shows up in your communities and what tools people might bring to bear to address it directly. What do you want people to go away from this planning to do, prepared to do, willing to do, on fire to do to change this?
I think this might be a perfect opportunity to talk a little bit about Seattle Neighborhood Greenways and their new equity task force called Who Streets Our Streets, which I have a presentation slide. So let me go ahead, if it's okay with y'all. All right, can you see it? Yeah. All right. Also, I'm going to stand up as I can't stand sitting down. Yeah. So, as mentioned, Seattle Neighborhood Greenways has created a new equity task force, and it was done in June 2020. Really started in June 2020, in relation to the protests that were going on with the Black Lives Matter revolution movement that we're living in today. The board members itself are primarily BIPOC, and the reason that we started meeting and essentially just trying to figure out how can we take action with what's going on in our streets when it comes to police brutality amongst the Black, Indigenous, and people of communities, colors. Oh my gosh, excuse me, y'all. Excuse me. So essentially, we started meeting, we started thinking about our values, we started looking at policy recommendations, but we started asking ourselves, when it comes to police within our streets, what does that mean? And then what type of enforcement is there? So go ahead and show with the questions. Oh, give me a second. Sorry about that. Yeah. Oh, my apologies. My apologies. There are some questions that came up in order for us to really guide the policy recommendations that we have came up with here. And we started with taking a very extensive and thorough Excel sheet and breaking down policies that included police enforcement within transportation. Some of those questions were, are these laws racist? Do these laws prioritize property over people? And then from that, got some of those values there. With the police recommendations, or policy recommendations, came this is ceasing involvement of the police in traffic enforcement entirely. And that's because police enforcement within transportation sustains inequities. I happened to write a blog post on the Seattle Bike blog breaking down the inequities faced by bike communities within different modes of transportation. Another policy recommendation that we have is when seeking to reduce traffic violence, prioritize non-punitive methods for making streets safer and encouraging safe behavior. So knowing that our streets have been historically designed for cars, prioritizing cars, we're looking at it as prioritizing people. So once again, instead of thinking property to prioritize that, prioritizing people. Most recently, NACTO has done an event called Alternatives to Policing, and they talked about some examples of how the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency had actually hired, they hired people, transit non-union members to actually help to de-escalate policing. Another example is that we have here is abolish enforcement of activities and actions that don't harm people and repeal laws that have shown little or no impact to public safety, but have resulted in unequal enforcement opportunities to racially profile. Example of that would be repealing jaywalking laws. Once again, those are laws that are helping to prioritize cars and not people. Most recently, Tacoma, Washington has repealed one of the helmet laws. So that's great. And then the two other policy recommendations that we came up with were investing in people and communities to foster ownership of public spaces, trust, support, and invest in the owners and experts of individual communities. Guess I'll go ahead and stop sharing. But that's essentially the policy recommendations, and excuse me for little hiccups there, little nervous as I and many of us have. I mean, it's crazy that we're living in a pandemic and just not socially interacting with people. It's super weird. It is weird. But yeah, those are the policy recommendations that we had came up with from meeting. I mean, we've been meeting since June, and these are no easy conversations to have, but one way that we have looked at really helping to dismantle racism within transportation has been looking at policy for police enforcement within transportation itself.
Super. I would encourage any of you who have questions for Yes to drop those into the chat. Maybe ask the panelists to think about if you've got anything to comment on with respect to policing. And I know in particular, Charles's keynote was all the ways that has been such a problem. And I know as long as we're in the policy space that Dr. Thomas has thoughts about reparations too. So there are a number of policy angles we might bring in at this point.
Yeah, I think, so within the context of transit, we've been looking at the Thrivance group, we've been thinking about the ways in which transit has become a destabilizing element in many communities. And I know that a lot of transportation planners hear that and either don't believe it or maybe are triggered by it. But, you know, I can't get the image of the transit station, the Coliseum BART station at the abandoned Oakland Raiders stadium. And I remember, I mean, ever since I lived in Oakland, I've known that area to be, even before transit came, a place that was subject to both hyper policing as well as just destabilized housing, these unstable housing dynamics. But in Oakland now, and this is the case in other major metropolitan areas as well, you can literally track displacement trends. You can predict displacement and track houselessness along the transit network in any major metropolitan area. And so our curbside residents are taking shelter there because they don't want to leave the communities that they built, the communities that they're from. And so there's an element of shame and disgrace associated with the rapid introduction of transportation related investments. And so as I noticed our field, transportation planners moving toward incentivizing development around transit, encouraging density and changing zoning laws, I began to think about what the implications of these trends would be on communities that have already demonstrated that they can't absorb the impact of rapid urban renewal, including transit investments. And so what we did was we learned from our housing advocates, the housing advocacy space, and we took the model for community-owned land, community-owned homes, and transferred it to a model that we created called cooperative mobility hubs. And our thinking is that if you can maintain a sense of community ownership and access to wealth generation through transit investments and innovative transit solutions, like the micromobility options, as well as some of the rideshare options, if we can regulate and establish policies that redistribute ownership of those revenues back to the communities that they're exploiting, then maybe we can at least stabilize housing while we figure out how to remake the business case for transit. But going back to the point that I made earlier, I also am concerned that all that we know to be transit network planning is about moving the worker to the job or the fan to the stadium. And we haven't done enough to think about what it would be like to invest in centers of joy that maybe don't generate as much revenue. So I think the trouble with transit that causes it to be a location or a site of hyper enforcement is the wealth that it generates and who that wealth gets attributed to. And so I want to disrupt that by changing who owns the transit investments in the first place.
So you're talking about rebalancing, a term I saw I logged onto a webinar and it was asking me what I was prepared to pay for access to this information so that I can rebalance, because I'm somebody who's benefited from that accrual of wealth that came from taking and exploiting. And I wonder, I mean, that's an uncomfortable place for white people to lean into, is to know how we got here and what we've had access to without having to think about it. I'm a fish and I don't know I'm in water sort of problem. I wonder if anybody else wants to talk more about that as the idea of how do we approach working for people's right to move freely and at the same time be rebalancing those scales. That's a big lift, but how do we do that?
Yeah, jumping in quickly, one thing I think about to provide a framework is that a lot of people understand economic models, and what we're dealing with is an economic model that has a surplus of inequality. And what I mean by that is that there's people who get more than they need when it comes to access to move around. But that more than they need is taken from someone else. It's not that they went in and took it. It's you're actually getting more than you ever needed. You have more bike paths. You have more bus lines. You have everything you need. And then you also have the things you choose not to have, right? I don't know any poor community that can say, no, I don't want a bus path here because we don't want poor people coming into our neighborhood. We heard that coming from the northern end of Seattle. Oh, we don't want that bus route to come here because that comes from downtown Seattle. that's a proxy for the conversation of we don't want poor, Black, brown, indigenous people loitering in our neighborhoods, right? When we get to the core of it, what we're talking about is we're still wrestling with the lineage and residue of redlining in almost all of our cities. And we think, oh, well, that's gone, it's unconstitutional. No, you look at 2020, the transportation effects that we have, the harm of COVID that we have, and I'm going to do my best to connect the dots. In 1940, there were grandees in North Seattle that said, you cannot live in this home, you cannot buy this home, you can't even visit this property if you are Black, they said Black, Mongol, or Jew. That lasted until the mid-1970s here in Seattle. Any home north of Madison Avenue effectively had that de jure language in the grandee. So poverty was relegated to south of Madison. We have the Central District, White Center, Sodo, Rainier Beach. We now look at where the freeways are built. The freeways are built so that the particulates are falling in the poorest neighborhoods of our city, right? The Black folks had a fight so the freeway wasn't built above ground where Jimi Hendrix Park is, right? They literally stood there and said, you're gonna have to take us off of this land forcibly because we're not gonna let you build this contaminant that's gonna hit our community. We know now, fast forward another 20 years, the highest asthma rates are in the area where there's the highest levels of poverty, the highest level of particulates, where the truck stops are, where folks don't care, meaning folks in power don't care. Well, those particulates lead to asthma. Asthma now leads to respiratory disease. Respiratory disease in 2020 leads to what? It means you will likely die of COVID-19. The effect of racism runs so deep that what happened in 1940 is killing people in 2020. And transportation had its hand in it so deeply because it said, yeah, and we want to make sure you don't get to the north end. Right, this bus is going to turn left on Madison instead of going straight. We are deliberately complicit in the behavior of how transportation fulfills and manifests racism. And what we have to recalibrate is say, we're not going to allow it anymore, right? And this has been about, this is my last point here. We look at the light rail station, and many folks know this, but the only part of Seattle where the light rail station is above ground, meaning at ground level, not below ground, not 50 feet in the air, is in the poorest part of King County, the south end of Seattle. The number of deaths that occur by light rail is at that intersection. I live right up the block. The response was, well, that's the least expensive way we can get transportation to this area. What that says to me is you say, the cost of that life isn't worth the cost of me investing a bit more to put this thing underground. Right? If those are the decisions we're making, then we're not actually ever reconstituting a liberatory practice of transportation or mobility.
And thank you all for those comments. And that's one of the reasons too why, I discuss this assertion of arrested mobility, because I think it's important that I arrest your consciousness so that you are aware. It's almost disheartening that in this space, this mobility space, what tends to happen is this: we're asked to briefly discuss the problems and go right to the solutions. I'm here to argue that I don't believe that many people still understand the magnitude of the problems for us to even be talking about the solutions. So what I'm asking for is that we pause for a second and consider what damage has been done, so that then we can accurately prescribe what remedies are needed to eradicate what was done to us and all the people that were affected in the past. But too often when you go to these conversations, they want to move from 0 to 100 real quick, as we say in the Black barbershop, when level 10 isn't even understood at this point. We got to go back and make sure. I went to the public schools. I know they didn't teach me a lot of the history that I know now. As a matter of fact, the majority of Americans probably go to public schools. So I know they too didn't receive the history that we know now as professionals. So it's disheartening for us to have a conversation about solutions, just simply to, what it is to appease white fragility. The white fragility demands that we stop talking about what is happening and talk about solutions so they won't be as uncomfortable. And I think if we're going to get to where we need to go, everyone needs to be comfortable with a little discomfort. And so that's why it's important that we do spend time talking about what the issues are, because I don't think people truly understand. And so these aren't complaints or gripes. These are facts that we're talking about. You can look at this all across America. So let's not expedite the process, because if we do, we're going to continue to perpetuate the trauma and the inequities that we know exist today. So let's pause. Maybe COVID is here to tell us to pause.
I think COVID is a great example of what I was just thinking while you were talking, Charles. I was thinking about how even in the haste to identify and implement a solution, those so-called solutions happen at the expense of the people who are suffering the most. I remember, being honored to review proposals, for a major capital funding cycle. And proposal after proposal was about electrifying the bus fleets and adding housing on top of or beneath bus depots. And everyone was oohing and ahhing about how innovative it was. And you would turn to the priority population section and you would see the map where they have very articulately spelled out all of the various forms of harm and suffering that the map tools generate for us these days, where you can see where all the Black folks are with the dark purple spot in the map. And then they would get extra points on the proposal, the more of those dark circles they could fit into the map. Okay, so you met that threshold of impacting enough Black folks or enough poor folks. And then your solution is, okay, so we're going to electrify all the bus fleets and we're going to put the bus depot in the Black neighborhood. Like that's somehow saving these children from asthma and resolving the already existing noise pollution in the area. Like it's not taking up space that folks could be learning and teaching and having, fun in. It's just odd to me that similarly with COVID, the solution is always about how we can so-called evenly distribute the burden of getting us out of this mess. But that distribution always seems to be real heavy-handed when it gets to our communities. So open streets, slow streets, play streets, whatever you want to call it, not to, I don't have a judgment to make about the utility of it, but it's just not lost on me that we are where you look first when you want to solve a collective problem, right? But we're not willing to see the issues that are specific to and festering in Black and brown neighborhoods, unless it benefits white folks outside of the community.
Yeah, it is interesting to me that one of the things that COVID has shown in the transportation and mobility space is who really needs it, who it's a luxury for, and then who truly needs it. But what I don't see from my white allies in this mobility space is now them saying the data is clear. The people that need transportation the most are Black, brown, and low-income populations. Now, let's give all the funding to them. That still doesn't happen, even though COVID is taking place and it is revealing what transportation options are luxuries to some and a necessity to others. And so if you're genuine about improving people's lives through transportation and mobility, what you would say right now is that it's clear the data has shown us who needs it. So what we should do is advocate for a disproportionate amount of the funding to go to those communities to improve their transportation options and mobility. If that doesn't happen, if COVID hasn't given you enough data I don't know if we'll see the data you're looking for in our lifetime. So it doesn't give me hope if this moment doesn't cause people to pause and say, okay, it's clear now. The policing is dangerous in these Black communities. These Black and brown communities need these infrastructure investments. If it's not clear now, I don't know if it ever will be. And so we need to start having real conversations about that silence, because it's deafening.
Yeah, and I'm not one to believe that dropping vertical elements on top of old pavement or concrete in the hood is sufficient investment in these communities. So I know, Charles, not to speak for you, but some folks will hear that and think, well, we are, you know, investing, right? And you're not. You're drawing a straight line through and around the hood and saying that these Black folks now have an opportunity to leave their neighborhood, and therefore you've invested. Or you're putting these pilot projects and these experiments on top of ground that is literally toxic and killing folks today, and wasting money. And so if you are that in love and that liberated by the access that you have to bike facilities in your neighborhood, then you should be gung-ho about not doing a half-assed job about the installation of those types of interventions, meaning fix the public works infrastructure around it, reconstruct the pavement that you want to put the facility on. Give us concrete so we could look like Beverly Hills, or so we could look like Leimert Park used to look. But dropping quick dry paint and vertical elements where we have no maintenance plan to maintain them and no one intuitively understands how to use or not hit them, that's not sufficient type of investment. And particularly in Black and brown communities, we have come so far down this road of disinvestment and divestment from Black communities that you're going to have to add a little bit extra and start to program the spaces that we're being so critical of for being vacant or for not seeing certain types of modes in them. You're going to have to purchase the bicycles. You're going to have to plan activities and pay for resources so that people can actually enjoy the space without being criminalized in the ways that we have been for generations. Vertical elements are bollards, Adam. Those orange sticks that stick up in the street.
Or flexible posts when you're biking.
Just trashy.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yes, I was going to ask you if you had.
Yeah, so I should have talked about this a little bit when I was going over the resources that you can use. Look at all these lovely tabs that I have open, y'all. Okay, so with some of the resources that are out there and that are readily available, when to, say, hey, where do we start to provide a solution, but also still talking to communities in order to understand what the real issues and concerns are, is to start with redlining maps. This is with redlining that happened, it shows the federal government disinvesting in communities. I have here Mapping Inequality, which was released in 2016 by the University of Richmond, and they have recently digitized all of the redlining maps so that you can just drag and drop that data onto your maps as a place to say, okay, where are, with the integration and inclusion of using Census 2020 data, which was just released on that included April 1st data. Should note that the census end date is going to happen at the end of this month, so they extended that because of COVID-19. Well, with looking at redlining data is a perfect place to start with understanding what type of disinvestments are going on within transportation and why it has been going on for this long. Go ahead and stop sharing there.
Yeah, one thought both Yes and Dr. Thomas and Charles were talking about. We see it a lot that folks with a lot of capital, large major nonprofit comes in. There's an investment. The investment requires certain parameters to be met because they want to prove that you have the skill set to manage the funds for the community. And this is the greatest form of gaslighting I've ever witnessed. And the reason I say that is because you literally come to a community that you're unfamiliar with, tell them to operate under your rules upon which you've never taught them or showed them or actually trained folks to learn how to operate within. And then say, see, that's why we have to do it, because you clearly can't do it. And so we're going to give this money to an organization that can, which is overwhelmingly white organizations serving Black and brown communities. But because they have the capacity, they're able to get the money, and somehow they're stewards of these funds in our communities, which in my mind is mind-blowing. And you have folks that are like, I don't understand how you gave those folks money to serve us. That's one. Two is that our stories are never enough, right? It's a PhD needed. It's this expertise. It's that the truth of the matter is that the story, the experience is the PhD, is the experience. When someone says, I came from the gutter, you should be like, how much money do you need? Because you're standing in front of me right now and it's unbelievable that you're here. Like, what can I give you, right? A prime example is we started North Star Cycling Club here in Seattle. It's a Black, brown, indigenous cycling club. And we're trying to go around to the cycling community, which is overwhelmingly white. Let's make that very clear. And they're like, well, what's your vision, Edwin? Do you have a one-pager? Like, what are you imagining? Because we don't want confusion among the different groups. I said, we're getting melanated people onto bicycles to ride. Well, how do we know you're going to follow through and that there'll be a positive outcome to show that this investment made is going to be worth it? I said, you know what? We don't actually want anything from you. Leave us alone. And it was actually Cascade that we went to, and we said, look, let's get 20 bikes, give us 20 bikes, and we're going to have the community be able to ride with us Wednesdays and Sundays. We had 65 Black and brown folks come out 2 weeks ago and said, I'm down. All those bikes are being used on a weekly basis. And people say, well, we just can't get Black and brown people on bikes. We don't know where to tap in. We don't know where they are. They don't want to do this. Maybe it's not a sport for them. And it's like, no, we create artificial barriers to things because we don't actually want those people in it. They need bikes. Oh, well, Edwin, that's a huge capital. Yeah, that's not by accident. White people call cycling the new golf because it's expensive. So how do we lower the barrier of that expense and say, let's give folks bikes? You're going to ask our communities, what should the bike lane look like? Our communities don't have bikes to ride on the bike lane. So let's start from the beginning of the issue of not just what do our folks need, they're telling us what they need. Let's give them what they're asking for. And the last thing is, like, I hear a lot, well, let's get a needs assessment of our community. And I'm going to tell you this, if you need a needs assessment of a community, you're either not reading the literature or you're not in the community. And so you're in the completely wrong place.
And a lot of those nonprofits, Edwin, are located in Black and brown communities. And let's note they don't pay sales and property taxes.
Right.
Edwin, you grew up in the Bay, right? Did I recall that? Me too. And I remember around high school, maybe middle school, where the brothers in my neighborhood started making their own, adding their own motors to the bikes. Mm-hmm. And like hood pedal assist way back in the day. And they would get like arrested.
Yes.
For riding the bikes. And the bikes would get confiscated. And I don't know, I'm just thinking about like why folks are so shocked that even if there is a reluctance to use a bike, right? Or there's something that stings about seeing a pedal assist bike that you can pay $1.75 to use real quick, right, after growing up in a community where it's like everyone's hemmed up every day on the fence after school by police searching them and patting them down because they found a way to put the lawnmower motor on the pedal, you know? It's like these ideas aren't new to us. Tactical urbanism came from the hood, right? Our grannies been sitting out on the curb with their own folding chair, you know, with the squares, and the elders in our community been making parklets and playing chess and checkers on the corner. You know, I'm seeing the little library, they're cute, but the little library looking mailboxes go up, and it's like, man, I lived in Chicago for a minute, and I dated someone who used to give books away for free, lay them out on the corner. He got a fine for doing that. It's like we criminalized the innovation 10, 15, 20 years before, you know, the white community or a capitalist society grabs hold of it, just like we did with cannabis. And it stings a little bit. Like, nah, we don't want to come to your bike party, you know?
Right. We have a different kind. Ours has a fist and an afro in it. And it's different, right? Like, and you're right, you hit it on the head. I think of the Mission District where I grew up. And it's like any innovative form of transportation, of culture that we try to meld together gets over-policed, right? Oh, you have a lowrider, it's too loud, call the police. Oh, your car has hydraulics and it bounces, call the police. Oh, you're painted in a different color, call the police. Because it doesn't look like my gray, very modern Volvo Subaru. Like, it's okay that we're different, right? But it got so extreme that parts of San Francisco said you can no longer drive down the whole boulevard because they didn't want folks cruising, right? So you had to turn off because the cruising was a culture. It was cars bouncing, it was folks playing music really loud, and it was unbelievably beautiful. And that's happened in a number of cities.
Traffic calming. We got rid of traffic calming. No cruising. Right. And now you mad that everyone is going 70 miles an hour on Crenshaw? It used to be 5 miles an hour. It's odd.
And the same is true for how we ride. I mean, the 65 people that ride in the street, the number of times we get screamed at, honked at, what are you doing? Get out of the street. This is not your street. They're not screaming at white folks like that. Some do, because there's some folks that are pretty aggressive on the bicycle. But it's like, it's a constant policing of a community because white folks believe we're not supposed to be there, right? We're not the archetype of how it's supposed to be portrayed. You're not wearing the right Lycra. You don't have the right shoes. Your helmet's not bright pink. You're not doing it right. And what we're really talking about is a discomfort of lacking culture. Like, and I'm being dead serious, and white folks get really upset, but we have to be clear. I'm gonna go into my critical race scholar mode, is that race and racism is the deculturization of our communities. Black folks, brown folks, including white folks, right? When I ask white folks, well, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Sunnyvale. No, you're not. Where are you from? Oh, well, I'm a mutt, like my England and Germany. And sit with that. This country has stole so much of your culture that you now call yourself a mutt. You will never in my life hear me say that I'm a mutt. There is no culture to go back to say I have traditions and language and food and ceremonies. That's what we strive every day to hold on to, because we knew that it was taken and stripped and stolen from us. But I don't think most white folks realize that that same thing happened to you as well, because you had the choice to say, do I assimilate into whiteness, or can I hold on to a culture that is rooted in some tradition that is not white supremacy? And I say that because I remember I was in Standing Rock, and you had these white indigenous folks come from Europe, came to Standing Rock, and were like, we're here in solidarity. Folks didn't know what they were saying, but they wrote it down and said, we're in solidarity with you as indigenous people across the world. And it was unbelievable. They're like, we're relatives. We're not here to take anything. We're here to supplant what you had, to support. And we have to really think about, like, what is our culture? Because the United States, America, is not a culture. Hot dogs and American flags is not a culture. Saying that you fought to maintain slavery is not a culture. Like, culture is when you are inextricably bound to the brother or sister or non-binary folk next to you and saying culture is that I'm here because they are. In the Latino culture, we say, I am because you are. And if we don't have that connection, then I don't exist. In our current communities, it's so isolated, individualistic, that on a bicycle, I have people in cars who have bike racks and their bike in the bike rack honking at me. And I'm like, I thought we were the same. Clearly we're not.
I just want to say Destiny's comment about traffic calming was hilarious. I'd never heard that before. I'll be using that one.
Please do. It's the only traffic calming that actually works. You show me a better model. I'll wait.
I have the unenviable task of saying we're about 5 minutes from the scheduled end of this, and I'm looking at all the panelists saying this is incredible, and I don't want to shut it off. And we've got some questions from the audience. Are you all game to hang a little bit after the hour? And I'm looking for a couple of nods at least, and understanding that folks might have to log off because you've got an obligation elsewhere. On the West Coast, we're at the end of the day, so we can just coast into the evening. But those elsewhere, it's a little bit later, perhaps, or earlier if you're international. The questions, this is so great. I want to make sure we get to a couple of questions, and I'm trying to kind of cluster them perhaps. A couple that you might speak to, Dr. Thomas, around centers of joy and cooperative mobility hubs, and a little bit more on what that idea is. That's the plus side. Other questions, maybe Dr. Brown, you might tackle around ideas around automated enforcement and whether those are, good, bad, or somewhere in the middle for removing that chance of an encounter with a law enforcement officer. There are proposals, and there's been some expansion of it in Washington State in particular, and thinking about how is automated enforcement a tool, and how, sorry, I am jumping to solutions, but it's a solution that's coming up a lot in legislation. So whatever order you want to take those in. And there are some other questions, but I think these are two that have application pretty broadly.
I'll go quickly. I'm a fan of automated enforcement, so long as there's an understanding that any system that is not diverse is inherently biased. And what I mean by that is that just because you remove this sort of in-person policing to one that is computerized, if it's not diverse and inclusive within the ranks of the police force, what you're going to find is that those cameras are going to be disproportionately located in communities of concern or communities of color. Reason being is because they're going to be looking at the data that they have collected, which shows that crime happens or red light running happens in these locations without any understanding of the racism that went in to create where that indeed happens today. And so if they're distributed equally throughout a city, I'm a fan of it. If not, I'm not.
I'm going to add just real quick before Dr. Thomas answers this. I think we have to ask the question, what the hell are we enforcing? Because if we're saying that we need to enforce people to pay for transportation that is supposedly a human right to be able to move freely, and that we've socialized that through taxes, but then we're taxing someone again and punishing them because maybe they can't afford to pay that tax, then I think we're enforcing the wrong thing. I think if we're going to enforce anything, we should be enforcing people evading taxes, because that's what should be paying for our transportation.
Yeah, I think automated enforcement is troubling, but I think the term enforcement, as you stated, Edwin, is troubling because I think it's about who gets to call it enforcement. Because our own systems, our own networks of self-governance don't seem to be sufficient or allowed or resourced. And so, I mean, I think I like this idea of arrested mobility, Charles, because I do think there's time and space to just stop throwing like the whole kitchen sink at the hood, and to think of, and to like listen, right, and observe. And that segues into Centers of Joy for me. I recently doing an anti-displacement, and I'll be quick, I have a meeting, but doing an anti-displacement study in Fresno, a linked transit and housing study in Fresno. and discovered every time I would go to engage, particularly elders, they would have this common retort of like, nah, you're trying to take our property. You're trying to take easements. They would always say easements, and I would be confused, like, why does everyone know the word easement here? And I did my research and realized that there was a period of urban renewal or revitalization or whatever you call it in Southwest Fresno that literally took easements throughout an entire community, sufficient enough to ruin front lawns, front porches, fences were gone, and all of the spaces that these communities had created to gather, to have sacred tradition, to have rituals, to get married. I saw folks' wedding pictures on their front lawn that's now gone. And so to me, transit planning within the context of Black joy and brown joy and intra-community kinship formation and assemblages that aren't beholden to or bound to a geographic region, but like global identity, is about leaving enough space for people to self-determine what joy and mobility is. We did an archival research project because of these stories, and again, photo after photo of easements, what the city uses nominal land takes, photo after photo completely transformed the soul and the spirit of the homes on the block. And then entire generations of memories are gone because they wanted to widen the street for a bike lane that never got installed, by the way. That's the other thing. Y'all like promising us stuff and not building it. I think that's intentional though. But you know, centers of joy for me are I agree that we should be reclaiming space, you know, for joy and things like that. But can someone else have a turn to do it?
That is wonderful. We are at 5:02, and I want to respect everybody's time and invite people to drop your compliments to our speakers into the chat, because this has been really phenomenal, and we should have scheduled it for like 2.5 hours, but possibly we're all zoomed out. And remind folks that this summit continues through the week and that there are more great presentations coming up morning, midday, and afternoon. You can just punctuate your day with some fantastic discussions about how we get to real mobility and eventually real justice. It's going to take us a while. So I want to thank everybody again, thank our sponsors for making it possible to make this free. I know the Cascade folks will drop a feedback form into the chat so that you can let them know what you thought of the session. And thanks again to our panelists. If I could do like a round of virtual applause, I would do that.
Take care, Bob. Take care, team.
We'll see ya.
Love that hat. Love both of those hats.
Right on, Charles.